is the Games Behind the Games. I'm Jeremy Parish, and I'm here at the headquarters of Tigertron in Brooklyn, New York, to meet with creative director James Mielke to talk about their game Jupiter and Mars. And I can't wait to dig into the history behind Jupiter and Mars by talking to James about one of the games that helped inspire him, Eco by Sony for PlayStation 2. When was the first time you played Eco? How did you discover the game?
When I first played Eco, I remember I was working at EGM. Sony just came by and they brought by this little game called Eco. There was like no fanfare. I don't think the North American PR team at the time had much faith. And I put in the game and I was immediately blown away by the aesthetics, by the controls have always been kind of funky, the camera was funky, but despite that, there was a lot of charm to it, and the environmental puzzle solving was always cool from the get-go. I was kind of amazed just in general by this, and I was really disappointed that it failed to make a big impact commercially. Games where there's a sense of loss have always affected me much more deeply than the happy ending. Like this game has a bittersweet ending. Klonoa Door to Phantom Isle has a bittersweet ending. All the Panzer Dragoon games have a bittersweet ending, because usually the dragon parts ways with the rider. Yeah, games like this are the kind of games I've always wanted to make.
A big part of what makes Eco so interesting is that there's so much that's mysterious. Even Yorda and her not speaking in the same language as Eco, you just have to kind of piece things together on your own. I enjoy that more than explicit universe lore. Like let's put a database together and explain all the connections for everything.
And that's one of the things that's one of the big differences between Japanese games and Western games. Western games are much more literal. Western games also do a really good job at making all these things gel together, because like they storyboard things, they focus group test things, they really make sure that all these things make sense. There's that's not a narrative headache. But Japan, they're so much more willing to let the aesthetics do the speaking, and they don't feel the need to spell everything out. They're just, here's some cool characters in a cool situation, and it's heroic, and their priorities are much more different than Western game designers. And that works both ways. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but in the hands of somebody like Ueda, I think it's really a good thing.
I think it's interesting this game doesn't provide any sort of map guidance whatsoever. It's these big structures, almost monochrome. Everything is these sort of tan and brown stones, so you have to just get a sense of the space as you play.
I think Ueda wanted people to get lost, and I also think it was probably a technical issue, because it's not like a Dragon Quest game where it's a pure overworld map, where you can just go north, east, west, and south. You have to go up, you have to go down, you have to go through things. And trying to map that out would have been impossible.
Well, on top of that, Eco's just a kid with no inventory. He's got a stick, basically, and a girl.
Yeah, so this is a thing that makes the relationship between Eco and Yorda even more valuable. The fact that you don't have Yorda here. You don't need Yorda, but because of the fact that you went through the trouble to rescue her from the moment that you saw her in a cage suspended from the roof, you were instantly caring for this character, and now that you don't have her, you don't know if you're ever going to see her again. Of course, you assume you're going to, but you don't know at this point if you're playing for the first time.
Yeah, every time you kind of leave her on her own, the shadow creatures come and try to pull her through a portal. Like, the game becomes more melancholy when you're on your own.
Yeah.
Like, there's something about just having the presence of the two characters together that makes it less intimidating to travel through these huge abandoned structures. This castle is enormous.
Yeah, and you wonder if, like, well, what's my purpose here? What's my point? With Yorda, at least you have a goal together to try and get out. But without her, it's kind of like, well, what am I doing? Why am I progressing? Is it just about me now? It becomes a different game. And that's one of the things that I've tried to follow up with and include in my own games is the sense of companionship.
Do you want to give me the elevator pitch explanation of what Jupiter and Mars is about?
Well, Jupiter and Mars is a game about two dolphins who adventure through the world together, basically trying to shut down machines that mankind has left on in their wake, in their departure, in their disappearance, and it's still messing with the oceans. And so a group of elder whales who are wise, and they're the overseers of the oceans, but they're too big and too lumbering to make these changes themselves, so they enlist the aid of Jupiter and Mars to help them shut down these things that are poisoning or still destroying the oceans so that things can restore themselves and come back to life.
How big was Eco as an inspiration when you started working on Jupiter and Mars? Was it something that you looked at and said, like, you know, this needs to be part of the experience, or was it just something that kind of organically informed the game as you know you went through the process of designing it?
Well, I always wanted to make a game, I think, with two characters, because I think it's a lot more interesting to have that kind of like interpersonal dynamic, because that would, over the course of the narrative, become very important. I wanted to make a game that people remembered just like I remember Eco or Klonoa or Panzer Dragoon.
So, you know, in Eco, having Yorda with you, who doesn't do a whole lot, you know, in terms of expressing personal agency to get through puzzles and challenges, that becomes a key gameplay consideration, because you can't just solve a puzzle on your own. You have to solve it in a way that you can also bring her forward with you. Is there anything similar in Jupiter and Mars? Is there more to the presence of two dolphins than just the narrative and the atmosphere?
We're actually giving you two players to play as. You're more directly in control of Jupiter, and Mars is sort of like your action button. Jupiter is the thoughtful, analytical one, and she's the one, as the player, that kind of deciphers what's going on in the environment. And then Mars is the one who actually like takes action and sort of does the heavy lifting.
You know, we also talked a lot about the environmental design in Eco. Have you drawn any inspiration from the way the underground structures evolve and wrap around and have a sense of purpose and place in Eco?
Eco is a very hard hack to follow in terms of level design. The levels in Jupiter and Mars are more inspired, I think, by Super Metroid, or any of the Metroids really, because what we do here is that we actually gate off certain areas. But in order to get to the deepest parts of the game, you have to have certain power-ups.
So even though it's a VR game, which tends to have, I don't know, I feel like that tends to send the message that it's more of a casual kind of lightweight experience. It doesn't sound like that's the case with Jupiter and Mars.
Yeah, I think Jupiter and Mars is definitely a core game. It's a core game that we tried to make as accessible to all people as possible. Like I've mentioned before, it's playable in both VR and without VR, but with VR, it's certainly the more immersive experience. It's very important for us, especially because we're trying to, you know, impart a bit of a environmental message that as many people as possible see, play, and try the game. I think core gamers are going to be the ones to excel at, but it's accessible enough that anybody could try it and still have fun.
So are there any other games you want to call out specifically as inspirations for Jupiter and Mars? Not that I'm trying to say like this game is made of pieces of just other games, but you know, like inspiration plays a big part. You process things and bring them forward.
The game that probably very few people played that definitely was probably the biggest inspiration for us in a purely mechanical sense is a game called Sub-Rebellion. And one, it's a super good action game. It's just, it's slow and methodical as you would imagine with submarines and being underwater. But the killer mechanic for that game is the sonar mechanic, and you press the button and it basically lights up the entire screen in a wireframe, and when you look at things, it reveals things, reveals treasures, reveals enemies. It's a very simple game. I thought it was really breathtaking when I saw it because the wireframe thing was so cool. You know, if you like games like Rez and stuff, as I do, to see that wireframe, that kind of vectory feel in action on command every time you press the sonar button, that I thought was just the coolest thing. And when you think about that kind of mechanic and you think about, well, what else could utilize a mechanic like that? You think, well, dolphins, they have echolocation. It's different. The way we use it in Jupiter and Mars is different, but it's certainly inspired by Sub-Rebellion.
This is the story of Jupiter and Mars.